It's April 12th, 1968, in Toi Tien, in Vietnam. And Acting Sergeant Richard Dietelli is leading his unit to set up camp at LZ Sharon. What awaited them were likely nights of explosions, gunfire, ambushes, a lack of sleep, and plenty of fear. The Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front guerrillas fighting the American invasion in South Vietnam, would likely be watching them very closely. Acting Sergeant Dietelli knew that you're more likely to be killed by the Viet Cong than to ever see them. They blended into the jungle, had vast underground tunnel networks, and understood the local landscape like the back of their hand. But just in case the enemy did arrive, this party would have advanced warning. A German shepherd who'd been trained to sniff them out. As the GIs dug in and set up a command post, the dog wandered towards the centre of the camp. He'd been trained to sense enemy combatants, yes, but he hadn't been trained to spot tripwires. Nobody else noticed the thin, almost invisible string right in the middle of the open space where they were to set up camp. It was a mix of clever planning by the Viet Cong and sheer bad luck. The dog hooked his paw on the string and pulled it taut. A deafening explosion then rattled through the camp, bursting the eardrums of nearby soldiers. Remarkably, neither the dog nor the medic standing right next to the explosive were hit, although both were knocked senseless by the blast. Others weren't so lucky. Shrapnel had been sprayed in every direction, slicing into everything it hit with terrifying speed. One of the men furthest back from the explosion went down. It was Private First Class Darrell Bruce Helmke, who had only just joined the unit. He was a likeable kid, and he fit in well with the group. Acting Sergeant Dietelli knelt down beside him as a medic rushed over. It was pretty bad. He'd been hit in the throat by shrapnel and was bleeding profusely. The medic tried to stabilise his airway as Helmke moaned and tossed his head back and forth, a clinical sign of shock. But soon he stopped moving altogether. He'll be pronounced dead that same day. Just 18 years old. Helmke had fallen victim, through no fault of his own, to one of the Vietnam War's most common killers. Booby traps. The phrase booby trap actually first appeared in Victorian British schools during the 1850s, and back then it was meant to describe a harmless prank or a practical joke, like balancing a bucket of water on top of a door. In this case, a boob means an idiot or someone foolish, like when someone falls for a practical joke. But over a century later, and in Vietnam, the phrase would have a different meaning altogether. There was nothing harmless about this, and what's worse is that Vietnam was packed to the rafters with them. The Viet Cong were notoriously resourceful and crafty. They could make something to kill or maim an American GI out of just about anything, and often with disastrous and sometimes fatal effects. But you see, talking about booby traps isn't merely a way to talk about the inventive and brutal ways that the Viet Cong were able to kill and wound scores of American soldiers. It's also a helpful way for us to understand the Vietnam War as a whole. Don't worry, there'll be plenty of blood and guts for those who are morbidly curious, but today we're going to tell you the story of the Vietnam War through its most brutal weaponry. So, we're going to start by talking about the more makeshift, non-explosive traps that were common throughout the Vietnam War and how they were intended to cause massive damage to the enemy. And I think there's no better place to start than the ultimate Vietnam weapon, the punji stick. Sharp sticks have been a mainstay of human combat for thousands and maybe even tens of thousands of years. Prehistoric man and his ancestors were carrying these around to hunt and fight throughout antiquity. So it might surprise you to learn that when adapted for modern combat in the 20th century, they proved to be just as effective then as they were all those thousands of years ago. Punji sticks were sharp wooden stakes. Occasionally they'd be made out of bamboo or metal, but mostly wood. They'd be sharpened and then hardened with fire before being stuck in the ground in various formations and traps to cause serious injury. One of the most common types of Viet Cong booby trap is simply a camouflaged pit of punji sticks that American GIs would fall into. When they did, they would be scratched, cut, and sometimes even impaled by the sharp sticks. As you can imagine, this would cause unimaginable pain to the average soldier, who would now be both wounded and stuck in a pit. but it would also slow down any patrolling units and leave them vulnerable to attack when trying to get soldiers out again unscathed. But that's not all. Punji sticks were often coated with poisons from plants and animals, or even feces, in order to cause a disgusting and rotten infection, necessitating extensive medical care in some cases. Punji stick traps could also be a lot smaller, like the size of the average soldier's foot. If a GI was unlucky enough, it could stab straight through their boot and potentially even their foot. Small, cheap, simple traps like this were common in Vietnam, with some variations including metal spikes welded to plates or nailed to wooden boards. The dense jungle made these almost impossible to see most of the time, especially at night, so it caused an extensive number of injuries. What's worse, of course, is that punji sticks could be put literally anywhere, underneath trapdoors, in dirty bodies of water, rice paddies, bushes, foxholes, or even in seemingly random defensive positions, in the hope that during an ambush, a GI diving for cover would impale himself on one, taking him out of the fight. Much like other Viet Cong booby traps, it made every step a gamble. Occasionally, the Viet Cong would even dig pits beside each other, so that when a soldier fell in and needed help, his colleague would then get trapped in the pit next door, just like something out of the Three Stooges. Of course, just with a lot more blood. But over time, the engineering of such impalement traps got even more complex. A pivoted spike board was one option, where a board with driven spikes on an axle was connected to a trapdoor over a shallow pit. Stepping on the disguised trapdoor would then result in the spiked board rising and impaling the soldier in the face or chest, with devastating consequences. It's a little bit like when you see a cartoon character step on a rake, but with extensive lacerations to the upper body. There was also the sideways pit trap, where lateral wooden planks with spikes or punji sticks embedded were sprung together by large rubber bands. They were held apart by a stick inside a pit under tension, but when a GI fell inside, the stick would be dislodged, causing the spiked boards to snap together, not only impaling the soldier, but likely also trapping them too. Then there were bamboo whips, a brutal kind of booby trap that would catch patrolling US soldiers unaware. A length of bamboo, usually between 3 and 10 feet in length, was bent back under tension and often across narrow trails with a head loaded with spikes. Imagine a bent back fly swatter on its side rigged to a tripwire. When the trap was triggered, the bamboo would swing around at high speeds, often impaling soldiers in the torso or legs and taking them out of the fight for the foreseeable. The often poisoned spikes caused deep, messy wounds that could easily turn fatal. Other Looney Tunes-inspired traps included gravity-based ones like maces, which were absolutely devastating when their heavy weight swung from the trees and struck soldiers in the chest or head. Tiger traps also fall into this category, a board of sharp, downward-facing spikes dropped from a height aiming to crush and or impale. If the Viet Cong really wanted you dead, they put a stack of bricks on top for added weight. Makeshift dart-firing weapons were also common, like crossbows aimed at a specific spot, placed under tension and hidden within the brush. Sometimes they would use poison-tipped darts, or sometimes the bow was set in a shallow pit, set to fire up slightly, ensuring a hit to the legs or groin, which could prove very nasty. Other weapons included using the wildlife of the jungle itself, with venomous snakes and scorpions buried in camouflaged holes or rigged to drop onto soldiers from boxes above. Many GIs had an intense fear of the poisonous snakes in the Vietnamese jungle, and the Viet Cong knew that. They would hide snakes in soldiers' packs and tie them to trees by their tails at face height. Bites from snakes, like the Malayan crate, was enough to turn necrotic in mere minutes. It earned the name two-step snake for a reason, because that's how far you'd get after being bitten by one. Knowing that the Americans wanted to avoid these slithery critters at all costs, the threat of snakes alone in bodies of water could cause soldiers to try and avoid them, which funneled them into other deadly traps. And all of this is before we've even gotten to a single explosive. Which kind of begs the question, why fight this way? Why did the Viet Cong engage with such Stone Age level traps? Well, the reasons why will tell you a bit about the makeup of the Vietnam War itself. Firstly, the Vietnamese have a long and proud tradition of resistance to foreign occupiers that actually goes back thousands of years. Whether it was the Imperial Chinese in 900 BC, the Mongols in the 13th century, or the French and Americans in the 20th century, these are hearty people who know how to fight and how to survive. The Viet Cong knew they couldn't defeat the United States in a conventional war. The US had overwhelming firepower and air superiority. So the Viet Cong had to fight asymmetrically. A defensive, attritional war meant booby traps were a necessity. And the logistical nightmare of being bombed constantly led to the creation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail to ferry supplies to the guerrillas. But, at times, supplies simply weren't available. So the Viet Cong used what they had. The jungle, bamboo, punji sticks, physics itself, and stolen weaponry in order to survive. But the Viet Cong strategists also knew their enemy very well. They knew that a war of attrition, combined with such vicious booby traps, would sap American soldiers' energy on the front lines. They also knew that it would draw the war out and ensure a high casualty rate for the Americans, which would, with enough time, turn the US home front against the war. And in the end, that is what happened. So booby traps were more than just wounding and killing soldiers. It was part practical, but part strategic as well. The constant bombing led to further instances of strategic change by the Viet Cong too, such as their extensive use of tunnels, which they also booby-trapped heavily. So-called tunnel rats, American GIs armed with a pistol and a knife, were often sent into these tunnels alone in what must have been one of the most terrifying roles in the entire Vietnam War. This further entrenched the psychological toll that the war took on US soldiers. But, as we know, the Viet Cong's traps weren't just limited to their environment. They would also evolve in the classic sense of measure and countermeasure that we see so often in war. For example, the sheer amount of ordnance dropped on Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War was absolutely staggering. But it came with a cost. For every 100 bombs that exploded, a single one might not. These duds were then often harvested by the ever-resourceful Viet Cong to make high-explosive booby traps too. But in truth, the Viet Cong used all manner of explosives to set their traps, from small grenades looted from GIs to massive anti-vehicle ordnance. Mines were often gathered from a wide range of sources, as well as dud US munitions being captured. The Viet Cong also used old Soviet and Chinese stocks that had been laying around from before, as well as older mines captured from the French in the First Indochina War. They even busted out the old World War II vintage mines that came from Germany and Japan, supplied by Russia and China, respectively. And they would use ingenious ways to hide them, putting them in cans of food and supplies. A common example of an explosive trap involved putting the pin on a grenade, but keeping the handle held down by placing it in a can of food. When the can was disturbed, either by a tripwire or a hungry soldier, the grenade would be pulled out and detonate. Often, Viet Cong guerrillas would adapt American grenades by taking out their delayed fuse, meaning that they would explode the second the handle was released, leaving US forces with no chance to run. This basic pin-out, lever-held-down approach would work for all kinds of ways to hide explosives. They were placed inside coconuts and even in hardened balls of mud that would explode when stepped on, which was a very quick way to lose a foot or a leg. Another tactic was putting rubber bands around the lever and then storing the grenade in thatched roofs of huts. When the soldier came to burn them down, as they often did to stop them being re-inhabited, the fire would melt the rubber band, at which point the grenade would explode, usually within the effective range of a soldier. Explosives were also used to combine different kinds of traps together, resulting in some pretty gory episodes. There are descriptions of the leg-sized punji stick trap we mentioned earlier that would be incorporated with a grenade, so the soldier's leg would then become trapped and subsequently be violently blown off, ensuring certain amputation and a likely painful death. Other strategies included hiding explosives in the body of a bicycle, which would be rigged to blow when ridden away by a GI who thought that some Viet Cong guerrilla had abandoned it. All the mines and explosives used were intended to cause maximum casualties. So-called bouncing betties would leap into the air before exploding at chest height and shattering in every direction. Surviving one of those going off in the middle of a squad was down to total luck. But the Vietnamese also had Chinese variants of claymores, directional mines filled with ball bearings that could eviscerate a group in seconds, whilst American-made variants were designed to explode Outwards, in a cone-shaped arc for a wide field of fire, Vietnamese variants provided by China were designed to explode inwards to cause as much carnage as possible. But still, much of the equipment used was formerly American. Mine warfare instructors of the 4th Infantry Division advised that, quote, "Nothing that can be of value to the enemy should be left behind. Even a burned-out radio battery still has enough juice to detonate an explosive charge if properly set in series. The Viet Cong will police up everything, including spent casings, to use against us." Colonel David Hackworth, who fought in Vietnam, would go one step further, saying that, quote, "Everything they used, we gave them. We threw away our sea ration cans, we threw away our used batteries, we threw away coffee cans. If a 500-pound bomb didn't explode, that provided them with the raw materials for their booby traps." Triggering devices ranged from the simple tripwire and the lever held down mechanism all the way up to more complex gadgets. Flashlight batteries, wristwatches, field telephone hand cranks, and mousetraps were all used in various configurations, showing the ingenuity of a force fighting with very few traditional resources. And to make matters worse for the average American soldier, the Viet Cong analysed what the US military would do, their operations and procedures, and then exploited those to cause further damage and chaos in their ranks. Take the helicopter, for example. Due to the thick jungle terrain that the US often found themselves trekking through in Vietnam, wheeled vehicles often couldn't get to certain places, which was a problem if you have a friendly soldier that needs immediate evacuation. American helicopters, despite being targeted themselves by the Viet Cong with gunfire and rockets, got pretty good at scooping up the wounded and evacuating them for medical care. If a wounded person in Vietnam made it to medical attention in time, they had an over 95% chance of surviving, which are pretty good odds. However, helicopter landing zones were pretty isolated and easily targetable because they were often held in small clearings. The Viet Cong, however, did their best to exploit this vulnerability, and thus the helicopter trap was born. 3 stakes would be placed lightly in the ground and would be loosely tied together by a tripwire connecting to explosives either on helicopter landing zones or in the surrounding tree canopy. The idea was that the rotor wash of a landing helicopter would blow the line taut, causing the trap to explode and taking out the helicopter as well as medics, the pilot, and even the soldiers trying to evacuate the wounded soldier on the ground. It wouldn't be the first time that the Viet Cong would exploit the dead and dying to their advantage. Often grenades were placed under dead bodies, waiting to be turned by GIs looking for souvenirs, intelligence, or supplies, at which point it would explode. The Viet Cong would even mine piles of dung, knowing that the US military procedure was to clear an area in an effort to make the water table more sanitary. Not even dung was safe, and it showed a real intricate knowledge of the US operations on the ground. It also took a massive psychological understanding of one's enemy to fight this way. The Viet Cong learned really quickly and during the early years of the war not just to attack things with strategic significance, but also things like flags and war trophies. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong both flew flags a lot, and many would be captured by US soldiers looking for some trophies. When forced to retreat from a location, flags would then be rigged with explosives so that when the US troops took it down, it would go off. A cruel end to punish the hubris of those who wished to find loot to take home. But after all of these examples, you may be left asking this question. Beyond the strategic and practical sides of this kind of fighting, what exactly was the logic behind setting so many booby traps all over the place in so many different variations all the time? We can understand it on a strategic level, sure, but what about on an individual level? Well, for one, they were both cheap and effective at taking many soldiers out of the fight, some for good. Between January 1965 and June 1970, 11% of army deaths and 17% of wounds were the result of booby traps. During 1965 alone, up to 70% of US Marine Corps casualties were caused by mines and traps. And they were hard to see, as we've mentioned, which had a considerable psychological toll on Vietnam veterans who survived the war. Colonel David Hackworth, who we mentioned earlier, also spoke of an experience he had back on home soil in this regard. He said that, "Months after I left Vietnam, I found myself walking across an open field and I suddenly said, 'Where am I?' and froze. In my mind, I was in a minefield. It took a few minutes for me to work out that I was not in a minefield. The reality is, most booby traps from the Viet Cong were almost impossible to see, and there was often nothing that soldiers could do to avoid some of them, whether it was a nearly invisible tripwire in the middle of a dense jungle canopy, or whether a bomb or a pit had been camouflaged by the environment. It left this pervasive feeling amongst American soldiers that at any time they could lose a foot, a leg, or their lives. Just takes a bad step or some bad luck. Second Lieutenant Mike Ransom wrote of how hard it was to find Viet Cong traps, stating, quote, "Our primary danger here, though, is not Charlie, a derogatory term for the Viet Cong himself, but the mines and booby traps he sets. The first night I spent in the field, an ambush patrol from the 1st Platoon had 3 men wounded when they set off a booby trap grenade. This morning, the 2nd Platoon took 14 casualties, including 1 killed, when they set off 2 mines while on a road clearing mission. So far, my platoon, the 3rd, hasn't had any trouble, but these booby traps are so well hidden that no matter how good you are, they'll get you." And one such hidden trap would be both crude and ingenious, only requiring a few basic ingredients: a single bullet, a nail, some wood, and bamboo. Together, these made a nasty concoction known as a cartridge trap. Here's how it worked. A guerrilla would start with a bullet. It could be any bullet, but larger calibers were preferred, obviously. They'd then place this bullet inside a short, hollow piece of bamboo attached to a small wooden board, so that the bullet could stand up straight with its top poking out without falling over. In the bottom of the bamboo would be a nail, a spike, or a firing pin that the bullet would be carefully placed onto. Then a thin camouflage would be placed over the top, hiding the bullet. An unsuspecting US soldier would come along and step on the bullet. The pressure would force the bullet down into the nail, which would ignite the powder in the bullet, causing it to shoot directly upwards thanks to the bamboo, usually into the GI's foot, blowing it to smithereens. It was effectively a one-shot gun that you didn't need to be around to fire, and for this reason they were referred to as toe poppers, for pretty obvious reasons. But it, of course, could be a lot worse than that. Such bullets could shoot up through or into a soldier's body via the legs or groin, causing internal devastation at a tiny cost. And it all boiled down to pure luck, whether you were hit at all, and if you were hit, whether or not you survived. Specialist John Cook wrote in a letter on New Year's Day in 1970 discussing how much that sense of luck was felt among American troops on the front line. In the letter to his family, he said, "I think I told you about my CO, Captain Camp, stepping on a booby trap. Blew him up pretty good. Well, he was lucky. He lost his right gonad, both legs were broken, and he was in danger of losing his left leg, his eye, and being deaf. He'll be in the hospital for at least a year. It took every bandage we had to patch him up, but they fixed him up. His radiophone operator was 10 feet behind him, only caught 1 piece of shell fragment, and died. We held his services when we got back. Odd how these things happen. That same operation, the man right in front of me stepped on a tripwire. The mine was only 5 feet from me. Nothing happened. I'll never complain about my luck again." This was the nature of the war in Vietnam. Never seeing your enemy, with your squad mates seemingly randomly blown to bits out of nowhere. Some surviving with life-changing injuries, whilst others took a single shrapnel hit that turned out to be fatal. Vietnam had been made a death trap, and every GI knew it. Some soldiers got the worst of both worlds and were killed with an enormous explosive device which eviscerated them instantly, potentially a painless way to go, but with not enough contents left to fill up a body bag. Second Lieutenant P.J. Caputo spoke of one experience he had heard of that must have been truly harrowing to see in person. He said, quote, "It was a rare phenomenon, but some Marines had been so badly mangled there seemed to be no words to describe what had happened to them. Sometime that year, Lieutenant Colonel Mayers, one of the regiment's battalion commanders, stepped on a booby-trapped 155mm shell. They did not find enough of him to fill a Willy Peter bag, a waterproof sack a little larger than a shopping bag." The psychological aspect was really powerful, and in both turning whatever they could find into booby traps and having enemies regularly succumb to those traps, there was a culture of fear throughout the Vietnam War. For some, this led to intense paranoia about every blade of grass. Nothing could be trusted, not the landscape around you, not your supplies, not dead bodies, nothing. And so, when every single step could be your last, it seriously slows down an enemy force and naturally makes some afraid to even go out on patrol. Among others, it would engender a sort of callous apathy towards their own lives, which led to undue risk-taking and made them vulnerable. Others still would feel intense rage, especially after seeing so many of their colleagues killed and wounded, but never spotting an enemy on which to take out their vengeance. Unfortunately, such emotions would lead to some of the worst atrocities of the Vietnam War, like the My Lai massacre, where soldiers took out their grievances on innocent civilians in place of the real Viet Cong. This not only pushed local Vietnamese further into the arms of the guerrillas, but it was also a bad look back home as the war grew increasingly unpopular. And it's in that kind of understanding where the legacy of Vietnam's booby traps resides. Beyond the horrible injuries, the maiming, and the death, it tells the story of the Vietnam War itself. From the macro strategy of fighting a one-sided conflict, to exploiting the understanding of American military goals, to maximizing the stress and unease that soldiers faced every day, to the Viet Cong's knowledge of the battlefield, to even targeting of the home front by drawing the conflict out. No matter what you look at when it comes to on-the-ground fighting during the Vietnam War, you can't explain any of it without a fundamental understanding of these crude but deadly devices and their life-changing effects on American soldiers' bodies and minds. And that's an important lesson to remember in a time where, globally, war feels like it's on the horizon. No matter how strong your weapons are, you might still be bested by a sharp stick.